Welcome. This is Discipleship with Monday in Mind, conversations about following Jesus in everyday life from St. Albans Church. As I was preparing this week, I was reminded of an unfortunate incident that happened. I was speaking in a church we were part of, and Abby was singing that morning, and someone went up to Abby afterwards and said, "We didn't realise that Chris had an older daughter." Which I didn't know quite what to do with. And it's one of those things where you go, what do I do with that? And we are, as a very poor way into this, we're going to be looking at the Psalms over the next few weeks. And as I look at some of the Psalms, I go, what am I to do with that? We're going to be starting this kind of mini-series over the next 3 weeks on Psalms that have shaped me. But before we get into that, if I was to ask you a simple question this morning, I wonder if I was to say, what are the Psalms for? Now, the Psalms of this book we find in the middle of the Bible. They're full of short chapters, written in a very different style to the rest of the Bible. But what would you say they are for? If you've read them before, I wonder what you think. And it's not meant to be sort of a trick question. Because I think if I asked you about some of the other bits of the Bible, you'd be really clear or articulate on what they were for. If I said, what are the gospel, what we call the Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, what are they for? I think most of you would go, well, they tell us about Jesus. They tell about his life. If I asked you about the history books that we see in the Bible, they tell us about the history of God's people. They tell us the stories of how God's people came to be and his faithfulness, God's faithfulness to them through the generations. Even some of the books that are tricky in meaning, some of the sort of prophets books or the apocalyptic books, difficult though they can be to get our heads around, we understand their purpose. They're there to challenge injustice, to bring people back to God, to lift our eyes towards his future. But what about the Psalms? What are they there for? Because at first glance, they seem, to me at least, a little unusual. They don't seem to tell a story from beginning to end. They don't offer a sort of systematic theology. They don't contain a list of instructions. They don't even always explain themselves. And at least I found at times they can seem frustratingly elusive as I've wrestled with them. And yet, often I think we want to try and force them to do things, the things that we're looking for. We try and force them to be complete or logical or systematic or instructive. But I wonder when we do that, we might miss something. The top of my bucket list for many years had been to go to Italy, to Verona. I wanted to see the opera in the Arena di Verona, this 2,000-year-old amphitheatre. And I remember sitting there as the sunlight sets, and there are only stage lights. The rest of the lighting comes from people holding candles. And the sun is going down beneath the ruin of the amphitheatre. And as they sang the aria of Nessun Dorma, I found myself moved to tears. And this was a song popularised by the Italian 90 World Cup, but it's kind of become synonymous with opera the whole world over. But if someone came up to me in that moment and said, why does this song matter? I'm not sure what I would have said. Or if they said, could you tell me 3 good points about this song? I wouldn't have been able to offer that back to you. I would have struggled. But it didn't mean it didn't move me or it didn't shape me in some way. Or take great artwork, for instance. You rarely walk up to a masterpiece and say, yep, person in a dress, seen that before. Or flowers in a vase, very obvious, know all about that. No, you don't. You stare and you dwell and you linger and you observe and reflect and chew. And I wonder if the reason we struggle with the Psalms is that we tend to read them in the same way we want to read everything else. We come looking for information. We want the key points, the takeaway, the application. The very first date I went on with Abby, we'd gone out for a curry. We went out for a curry. It's not very romantic, is it? We went out for a curry. And unbeknownst to Abby, in the background was something very dear to my heart. So she sat talking to me, and she later said, I couldn't believe he didn't butt in. He just listened to me the whole time. He was so loving and attentive like that. I thought, wow. But she said he did this weird thing. He kind of looked over the top of my head. I thought maybe he had like a lazy eye or something. It was a bit odd. It wasn't until much later she realised that the Cricket World Cup final was on behind her. And I'd spent the entire day watching that. That's not even the worst bit. We managed to get through drinks and 2 courses in about 40 minutes. And I've got to be honest, we were quite young when we met. I was still 19. I hadn't eaten out much in restaurants at that point. I thought the point was eat the food and then get on with life. I didn't realise that being in the restaurant was the experience. I thought it was just a fueling station. And so I was like, okay, eat food, let's crack on, and we'll see how we do. Let's wolf this down. You know, the Psalms are poetry. And poetry refuses to be rushed. It's there to slow us down. It's there to be chewed on, reflected on in a different way. Poetry, as much as it annoys me, doesn't give away its meaning easily. I'm desperate for it to just give its meaning to me and go, right, got that, and move on. It doesn't. It asks us to slow down, to linger, to sit with an image, to revisit a line again and again and discover something we may have missed the first time. And they're full of all of us, not just part of us. They don't just present to the academic part of us or the factual part of us. They tap into our emotion, our reason, our depth and purpose, our worries about failure and our doubts. As you read through this list of poems, we see that one is celebrating and then another's complaining. One's full of confidence and then one's full of doubts. Some are joyful and some are angry. And some, if we're honest, just seem confusing. But in a world trained by headlines, notifications, endless scrolling, the Psalms feel strangely different. I wonder because God is trying to do something different through them. The Psalms are not trying primarily to inform us. They are trying to form us. They don't simply tell us what to think about God. They teach us how to relate to God. They give us words for joy and grief and hope and disappointment, for praise and lament. They shape our desires. They train our imaginations. And they teach us how to bring our whole selves before God. If you're anything like me, when you come to the Bible, you're often saying, what does this mean? What should this teach us about what to do? What should I be doing next? Those are all great questions. But I think the Psalms are asking different questions. What are you longing for? What are you afraid of? What are you angry about? What do you hope for? What kind of person are you becoming? And in doing so, it revealed God is not simply looking at what does this mean or what does it teach us. He's speaking into our humanity, really. And it's not there just to transfer information, but to stretch the imagination. And there's a beautiful irony in the Psalms as you understand where it sits in kind of the history of God's people. Because many of them were written for worship. They were written for being in the temple, the place where heaven and earth met, where God's people gathered, and where his presence uniquely dwelt with them. Yet generations later, the people of God found themselves in exile. They found themselves far away from that place. The temple had been destroyed. Yet these songs remained. And the Psalms began to function to people as a kind of literary temple. There started to be this kind of temple that they could hold with them, like a portable sanctuary, where God's presence could just be people wherever they were. When they could no longer enter the courts of the Lord, they entered the Psalms. through prayer and lament and praise and remembrance. And they discovered that although they'd lost the temple, they hadn't lost God. The Psalms just became this way of inhabiting God's presence even when far from home. And I wonder if that's why the Psalms, if we allow them, can still resonate today. Many of us know something of exile, perhaps not geographical exile, but cultural exile. Or exile with people that we care about. Maybe a spiritual exile. We live in an age of distraction and anxiety. An age where some of us may just feel personally homeless. And the Psalms become a home for pilgrims. And they sort of give language to an ache, or words for grief, and songs for hope. We might present to people as we walk in that all is well. But beneath the surface, the things we really bring in with us on any given day, the Psalms, if we allow them, speak into that. It gives us an expression of what it means to be with the God of all, who loves us and longs for us. Before we get any further, I'd just like us to just take a bit of time, as we've talked about it, with this psalm. And so, if you're just get comfortable. If you want to take off your shoes, that's okay. You can relax. And we're just going to read through a couple of these verses and just sit with them. In a way, often we just want to consume things and get to the next thing. Let's just have a moment just to sit with them. So let these words just wash over you as we read out. How lovely is your dwelling place, Lord Almighty. My soul yearns, even faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and flesh cry out for the living God. Even the sparrow has found a home, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may have her young. A place near your altar, Lord Almighty, my King and my God. Fight the temptation to analyze, to try and work out the point of it. Just dwell. And as you look at it, is there something that stands out, a phrase or a word that just grabs you? Is there something that catches your attention? Or something you wish were true of you? How lovely is your dwelling place, Lord Almighty. My soul yearns, even faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Even the sparrow has found a home, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may have her young. A place near your altar, Lord Almighty, my King and my God. I wonder if you noticed anything in there. Does this perhaps awaken something in you? Does it make you ask a question? Or does it provoke something? And as it does, just begin to offer that to God and say, okay, God, this is maybe how you want the Psalms to work. And as we go through the rest of this, just hold this idea that they're not trying to tell us something, but perhaps shape something in us. So I wonder what might be going on in this psalm. The third thing I notice is that there is a kind of longing in here. And I wonder what kind of longing this is. There's a lot about God's house and court and dwelling place, and really strong language about what it means to be in them, to yearn, to faint for them. And as I've sat with Psalm 84 this week, I found myself wondering, do these words feel a little disconnected, if I'm honest? My soul yearns, even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and flesh cry out for the living God. They're beautiful words, perhaps even familiar words. But I wonder if they also feel a little foreign, a little alien to us. I suspect for many Christians, church is something we value, appreciate, even are grateful for. And we know it matters, perhaps. We know that it could be important. We know we're better when we're part of it. But do we yearn for it? Do we faint for it? Do our hearts and flesh cry out for it, what even that might mean? I think for many of us, if we missed church next week, we may well be disappointed. And we may feel like something was missing, but would we feel the kind of ache the psalmist describes here? I don't think this question is meant to make us feel guilty. In fact, I think it invites us simply to be curious. The question is not what's wrong with us, but rather, what did this psalmist experience that I might be missing? What was it about the house of God that evoked this kind of longing? What was it about being with God's people that stirred such a desire that made someone say, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere? I began thinking, Lord, am I missing something? Have I got something wrong in this? I think we may say, I yearn for this to be at the footy, but perhaps not at the church, or be with God's people. I think part of the answer is that when we hear the phrase the house of God, we instinctively think building or service or event. And the psalmist is thinking of something deeper. He's not longing for architecture or ritual. He's longing for the living God. The temple mattered for one reason, because God was there. The courts mattered because they were places of encounter. The gathering mattered because it's where heaven and earth were designed to meet. And I had to challenge myself as I thought on this. I wonder if I quietly settled for something smaller. Learning how to attend church, but perhaps forgetting how to hunger for God. Becoming familiar with services, programs and routine, but less familiar with the expectation we might genuinely encounter the living God in the midst of them. I wonder if that's why Psalm 84 feels so challenging and so attractive at the same time. It names a longing many of us recognise, even if we can't articulate it. Because beneath all our other desires, the desire for success and security and comfort and significance, there's a deeper ache. An ache for a home, for meaning, and for God's presence. And I think this psalmist has learned to recognise what his soul is hungry for. Secondly, what kind of house is this? There's another thing that strikes me as I read Psalm 84. It's full of the language of home and the implications of home. Even the sparrow has found a home and the swallow a nest. It's a really curious image. The psalmist is speaking about the temple, yet he describes it as a place, he doesn't describe it as a place to visit or an obligation to fulfill. He describes it as somewhere to belong, somewhere safe, somewhere life-giving, somewhere that he wants to be. I wonder if perhaps part of the reason is church can feel sometimes more like an event than a household. You know, we're good, we're well behaved in the church globally. We arrive, we sit down, we sing the songs, we listen, we continue talking and chatting over coffee and head home. And these are great, these are gifts. Yet human beings seem to be wired for something deeper than attendance. We're made for belonging. Beneath our desire for success and security is a deeper longing to be known, loved and welcomed. And somewhere where we can bring our whole selves, somewhere we don't have to pretend. somewhere where we're remembered when we're absent and celebrated when we return, somewhere that feels like home. And I wonder if that's what made the early church so compelling. They didn't simply gather for worship, but they shared their lives. They ate together, they carried one another's burdens, they prayed for one another. They knew each other's stories. They expected God to be present amongst them. I remember the day that Abby and I had a miscarriage before Wilbur was born. And coming home from the hospital and feeling the ache of that. And our home group were just there. And one of them grabbed me and said, I have nothing to say that is going to be of any use. I just wanted you to know that we were here. He just held me. The depth and texture to life that went beyond attending. And I found myself just reflecting, going, is this asking different question? Not why don't people long for church, but what kind of community are we becoming together? As we hold on to this, we're moving to a new space where we're going to be really visible in a different way in this place. What does it mean to be that kind of community together? What are we going to become in that? Because actually the truth is, none of us experience church as a consumer only. Each one of us contributes something to the makeup and the culture and the feel of this place. Every conversation, every welcome, every act of hospitality, every prayer, every encouragement, every choice to move towards someone, even when we don't really want to, helps shape the kind of community we become. And little by little we create an environment where people either feel like guests at an event or they feel like family in the household. You know, we can never manufacture God's presence. That is always God's work. But we can create the kind of community where people feel seen, known, welcomed and loved. And we create a kind of place where stories are shared, burdens are carried and grace is experienced. And I think this is what the psalmist is longing for. Not a building or a program, a place where the living God is present and people discover what it means to come home. And I love that when I see it happening. And I see it happening in some of our pockets where we just walk over to someone and go, I just want to really know how you're doing. Where people remember pockets of your story and they just offer it back and check in with you. When you get a message in the middle of the week from someone saying, you were just on my mind. So I was just praying for you. Is there anything I can be praying for? People whose lives are oriented around God's presence. You know, worship's not an activity added onto life. It becomes what life is. And then finally this. The challenge is to become a pilgrim people. Have you seen that in there? There's this image in there that I find encouraging and also confronting. The psalmist describes God's people as pilgrims. Blessed are those whose strength is in you, whose hearts are set on pilgrimage. I think I subconsciously miss that when I read it. I think I subconsciously read, whose hearts are set on destination. As in, I want to get to somewhere. I want to know what the point is. I want to know that I've got to where I need to be. I wonder if we're wired for journey, or actually, if we're honest, we're wired for destination. When it says, whose hearts are set on pilgrimage, I go, ooh, sounds a bit exhausting actually. Could my hearts be set for an app for Uber and I can get there a bit quicker? You watch Jesus in the Bible, he's never in a hurry. It's exhausting. He's just kind of like ambling everywhere. He'd never turn up to a meeting on time, would he? Jesus seems to be non-anxious and relaxed and operating in a different way. A heart set on pilgrimage, not a heart set on destination. I love the sense of it because I don't have to pretend I've arrived when I'm a pilgrim. I can still be on a journey, still be someone who's shaped by the road that they're traveling on. You know, the Christian life is not presented here as a destination to be reached, but as a journey to be walked. There's so much movement in the Psalms. The pilgrims pass through the valley of Baca. They go from strength to strength. Their hearts are set on pilgrimage. Nobody's sort of arrived, but the people are still moving. And I wonder if that's important to hear. We spend a great deal of our lives waiting for things to settle down. When I get to this, that'll be good. We tell ourselves that when this season passes, when these things become a bit less demanding, when our health improves, when life feels more certain, then perhaps we'll feel closer to God. Perhaps we'll be able to experience more then. Yet Scripture just tells a different story. Again and again, God seems to meet people on the road. Abraham leaves home and discovers God's faithfulness along the way. Israel learns to trust God in the wilderness. Ruth leaves everything familiar behind. The disciples leave their net. The early church finds God at work as they're scattered and as they're sent. I wonder if pilgrimage isn't an interruption to this, but is the point. Perhaps that is spiritual life. And that if things feel unsettled at the moment, if things are shifting around you, if you find yourself in those seasons or between seasons, carrying questions you can't answer, I want to encourage you, you might be closer to the heart of this psalm than you realized. To my delight, this psalm does not say, "Blessed are those who have everything figured out." It just doesn't say that. We don't find that in Scripture anywhere. But blessed are those whose strength is in you. The blessing not found in certainty, but in dependence. It's not found in having arrived, but in finding to learn to trust in God in the midst of the road. And I wonder if this is an image of pilgrimage that's so important for how we think about church. It's not a gathering of people who've reached the destination. It's a community of fellow travellers. People at all kinds of stages on the journey, walking together, trying to find God in different ways. And we encourage one another, we pray with one another, we laugh with one another, we carry one another through difficult seasons. We remind one another of God's faithfulness. And when our strength is running low, we just get alongside others who can celebrate and perhaps lament with us. And together we help one another move forward. And there's something in just finding companions for the journey. The question is not simply whether we are attending church, but the deeper question is whether we're allowing God to form us through the journey we're on. Are we becoming more gracious and patient, more prayerful, more attentive to what God might be doing, and more like Christ? Because the pilgrims aren't the ones saying, this is where we're trying to get to. They're just gently aware that they're changing. I realise I'm not the person I want to be. I'm not the person I once was either. I think there's something in that. So as we conclude, I found myself coming to a simple thought. This psalmist is longing for something that in many ways he can't see. He knows the temple. He knows the courts of the Lord. He knows what it means to journey towards where God has promised to dwell with his people. And the ache of wanting to be there. But we read this psalm from a different place to where it was written. We read it after Bethlehem and after the cross. And we read it after the resurrection and Pentecost. And that changes how we can live in these words. Because when the psalmist longs for God's dwelling place, we know something he didn't know. That he was coming to dwell with his people in a new way. That we would one day see Jesus step into history and become the place where heaven and earth meet. And we know that longing for God's presence would find its fulfillment not in a building, but through his Spirit being in us. You see, the psalmist's longing is our longing too. We may express it differently. We may disguise it in different ways. But beneath so much of what drives us is the same ache, to be at home, to belong, to know that our lives matter, and to encounter the living God. And the good news is that God hasn't left us to find our own way home. Jesus comes looking for us.